First of all, talk very briefly about the idea of objectivity and the problem of dualisms that we sometimes find tied up with reductionism. That leads on to the issue of abstraction and different kinds of abstraction that might be good for your science or bad for it. I'm going to want to say a little bit about statistical inference and the holy grail, the dream of having objective statistical discoveries. Aspects of reality, I'll hand over to Mark for. And finally, I want to try and give an example of what I might call a fellowship of critique. I'm exploring the communal dimension a little more, and it's an example that I've been involved with. Again, let's remember that objective, that we might be able to affirm, critique, and enrich some areas of science from a Christian perspective. So dualisms, here's a diagram where we might think that God has made all kinds of different things in the world. If you look at Genesis, you certainly get the mountains, the sun, and the trees, and the animals and the people, and very soon you realize there's language, and there's also not very much further technology. And then there are social structures, there's art, eventually economics, justice, and religious institutions all come up. And David suggested in his first talk how perhaps all of those are somehow even in Genesis 2 envisaged. But it's very tempting for us to pin one of those as being the really explanatory part of God's creation, the thing that really explains everything else. And often in our scientific world that tends to be matter. So God really made physical things, he made things that are not living, mountains and rocks, rivers, but there's a kind of temptation to take out the idea of matter as being the thing that really explains everything else, including art and culture and economics and justice and dreams and language. So in order to avoid that kind of dualism, some people have ended up in another dualism, that rationality, that's what really explains everything. Perhaps in a slightly different sense from matter, you can put them together, but rationality is what our knowledge is all about. Rationality is the only guide to truth, and that part of what God has made is the truth. And so we end up, if you love rationality too much, then you end up perhaps denigrating what's seen as the subjective part of life, and the arts and all sorts of other parts of God's good creation become peripheral, because rationality is where the truth is. So to avoid these kinds of dualisms, if we keep in mind that God made the world entirely good and then somehow sin infected all of it, then we will avoid blaming any part of what God made, any subset of the created order, for the evil. And most of these symbols on my diagram could probably be picked out as having been demonized or blamed at some point for the evil in the world, whether it is particular issues of life and death, or language, confusion, technology for some people, art, social problems, gender bias, money, and so on. If we realize that all of it was made good, all of it is fallen, and somehow all of it is being redeemed by and for Jesus Christ, we might avoid that kind of thing. And we might also be able to get away from our culture's obsession with what is objective and what is subjective. I won't say more about that now. We're going to move on to a little bit more, though, about abstraction, because when we abstract matter or rationality, or maybe what is subjective, all of these things are kind of become idols very easily. But let's think about a different kind of abstraction, which we've already suggested is what science is about. I don't think science gets all that far by pondering the metaphysics. What is life? What is consciousness? What is matter? What is rationality? But let's think about a different example. Here's a photograph of a real place that I once went to, and I took this picture. If I were thinking about it as a scientist, I might abstract in a different way. I might abstract the physical side of it and start to think about what I can measure physically, the energy of things, or the mass of things, or interactions like that. I might abstract the biotic side of it as an ecologist or biologist and think about the processes of flow and life and death. But things that I can measure: growth, flow of nutrients, energy, interactions, competition. I might abstract instead in a very logical way and just make in order to do any of the previous kinds of abstraction, you have to start defining things, categorizing things. I might want to count how many species of trees there are in that place, or how many kinds of soil, or how many kinds of rocks. So there's a kind of logical science. I might want to look at the history of the place in order to understand why it is how it is, and the unique novelty and innovation that's happened there. I might be interested in what's new. I might be interested in the names for things and what linguistically can be done with this situation, and how different languages deal with the same situation. I might want to look at it economically and think about the relative value of different parts of it for monetary reasons, or perhaps for something else in another science. I might want to look at networks of people. So in that picture there are a couple of people walking, and I might want to think what goes on sociologically in this place. What is the sociological analysis of a park like this? Why does the path go the way it does? What was the ruined abbey for? Or I might look at it aesthetically, and I might even be able to do some kind of analysis in terms of aesthetics. And all of those are different ways of abstracting stuff from this real place. None of them necessarily has the last word on it, but all of them could be the basis of something you might call science. You might want to question some of them, but there's certainly some of those I think you can see are what we're doing. When I go as a biologist and go on a field trip, I ignore most of the interesting sociological stuff. I ignore most of the history unless I think it's part of the biological history, and so on. I have to ignore a lot of things. Next slide is for Mark to tell us a little bit about a Christian philosopher who helped us think in this way.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. I just have just a few minutes to look at a thinker. Last week I talked about Michael Polanyi, and he's a very interesting philosopher because he gives us a way of understanding reductionism, but also going beyond it, having a richer theory. And Duyvit is a Dutch Christian philosopher who many people have found very helpful when we want to look at this issue of reductionism in both science and philosophy. And obviously I'm simplifying massively, and I apologize for that, but what he's getting at is that each creature that God has made has its own kind of distinctive glory and splendor. And there I've got my little friend Derek, who is a very friendly crocodile. Well, I've got a few Dereks here. Now, philosophers, one of the things philosophers do is they try to think about what is distinctive about a particular kind of entity. How is it different from other kinds of entities? And so a very basic question in philosophy, which you see in Aristotle, in Plato, in many thinkers like Descartes, is what's the difference between a human being and an animal? Is there a difference? And you'll find that Descartes has debates about this. Aristotle discusses this. And what we've got here is an incredible story, which I haven't got time to tell you. Ask me if you'd like to. Is about a man who befriended, in Costa Rica, who befriended a 16-foot crocodile, and they became the best of friends. So we can philosophize about three things here, at least. The philosopher, Chito, the Costa Rican man, and Pocho, the huge crocodile, but there's also a relationship between the man and the crocodile. And in this case, it's extremely lovely. And there they are having a play fight. They're mucking about together in the water. And if you go on YouTube, you can actually see this. It's not a trick. It really is an incredible story. Now what Duyvit does, and also a philosopher called Vollenhoven, they suggested that we have to look at all these aspects when we look at humans and crocodiles and plants. We have to have a much richer theory of reality. And philosophers call this ontology. And if you were following what Arthur was saying, every thinker has got some implicit ontology. Every thinker has got an implicit theory as to how things are put together. And so what Duyvit suggested is that there are many aspects, from the numerical all the way up to the faith, and we have to honor all of these aspects. But it's very easy for some philosophers just to completely ignore some of these aspects. So some romantic philosophers just focus only upon the aesthetic. Everything is about the aesthetics of something. And they ignore the physical. And there are many, many thinkers who just focus upon the physical and they ignore all the other aspects. So this diagram, it gives us a way of making sense of different kinds of reductionism. Now, if you read the De Anima by Aristotle, you'll notice that what he's trying to do is to try and understand the difference between plants, animals, and humans. And in the De Anima, Aristotle gives his theory. I'm not going to explain that to you now, but very simply, we can distinguish at the least between rocks, plants, animals, and humans. And Duyvit's theory gives us a way of distinguishing between the crocodile on the one hand and the plant and the rock, but also how crocodiles are different from human beings. And as you know, crocodiles don't engage in high-level physics. Love them, they are great, you can play with them if they're friendly crocodiles, but they don't engage in scholarly activity. And that's because they don't function in the logical aspect. So, the other thing that is fascinating, and this is one of the most, well, it is a unique flavor, a unique aspect of Duyvit's theory, is that these aspects are not like a cake. Strawberry and then something else, then this and then that. Because these aspects, they interpenetrate each other. And I'll just give you one very simple example of this. When we talk about the joy of faith, we're speaking about how in this feeling we can anticipate the love of God, the hope we have in Jesus Christ, that this joy is penetrated by something in the faith aspect. Now, cows and crocodiles and ferrets feel things, they can feel pain, they have all kinds of ways of feeling things, but they don't have this feeling that is opened up to faith. That is something Duyvit and Vollenhoven say is peculiar to human beings. So it's an incredible, I can say a lot more about this, but it's a wonderful theory because it helps us to make sense of how there are irreducible aspects, but how all these aspects have echoes of each other in them. And I will end on that for you, Richard. I can't get to my brief.
Yes, that's brilliant.
Very difficult.
That was fantastic. So moving quickly, that Mark pointed out that if a philosopher focuses on one aspect to explain everything, then that doesn't do justice to the richness of God's reality. But I want to suggest that as scientists, we do appropriately abstract typically in one of those aspects, or at least we focus on one of them. So if you're a physicist, well, you can start with maths if you like, and I have my own little diagram. You focus on the numeric side of things. You abstract units in order to count. That's basic arithmetic, right? You can do geometry where you look at the spatial relations of things, and that's not just number. You can't get space from just number. Then early physics was all about movements and dynamics. That is another kind of science. Then what might be seen as a more modern physics is much more focused on energy and irreversibility and entropy. You abstract, and you need all the previous aspects to do physics, but you're not concerned about, for example, social interactions or aesthetics for your science. Then biology, of course, builds, but it has its own way of abstracting. And then, according to Duyvit and Vollenhoven, there is a sensitive aspect, which might be what psychology is particularly concerned with. There's an analytical one, he thinks, which is not so obviously a science, but perhaps that is what logic is basically concerned with. And so he goes on, this sort of historical aspect of what's new, what's formed, this symbolic aspect of how do we look at meaning and reference, the social aspect, in order to understand appropriate social interactions and hierarchies and deference, that kind of thing. Economic aspect, economics is not just maths, contrary to what some people seem to think. The aesthetics, if there is what kind of science it is, we're not sure, but it's definitely something different from the other aspects when you focus on the aesthetic. And then he says there's also justice. generosity is what this one really means, going beyond justice. And finally, he suggests something which Mark called a faith aspect, and it also has other sorts of funny names because it's not so well developed as a science. But it may be that each of these aspects gives rise to some particular way of thinking which will be really distinct. And so there's a reason why the maths department hasn't taken over the physics department. There's a reason why chemistry hasn't taken over biology. There's a reason why psychology hasn't taken over aesthetics or art, the understanding of art, much as people might try to claim that their discipline has the last word on everything else. And this, I'm sure you've seen it, probably whatever your discipline is, it's not. My wife has a dog, and I can't explain as a biologist what's going on in that relationship. According to good biology, that dog doesn't have any of the kind of functions that my wife attributes to it, and yet I can't possibly deny that there's something going on. It's very subtle, and so the same with a crocodile. So there are laws, Doivir tells us, there are probably characteristic laws in or relationships in each of these spheres, and conflating them, one easy way to see this is that some of the classic paradoxes appear to come from mixing up things like space with motion, or all sorts of other aspects get mixed up. That's a little bit about the idea of appropriate abstraction, not trying to say what is life, what is consciousness, what is matter, but what can we measure? We can measure growth, we can measure weight, we can measure behavior, responses. So there are certain kinds of entities and quantities, variables, which are very useful for us to abstract. And I've referred back to that problem of abstracting to metaphysical things, which you can't do science on. Category errors is another classic issue. If it was Gilbert Ryle, who not as a Christian, I think, or involved in this philosophy, but he said, if the tourist comes to Cambridge and says, after seeing all the colleges, but now show me where the university is, I want to take a picture of the university, he's made a category error, because the university is not a thing like one of the buildings. And category errors come up everywhere. I find them all the time in things I read and write sometimes. We might want to think that that's a similar issue there. We can get ourselves tied in knots. I put down methodological naturalism there because some people say that to do science properly, you don't have to be a naturalist and believe that nature is all there is, but you do have to be a methodological naturalist and do it as if it's all there is. And I hope you can see that if we take this framework of abstraction, we have a much more sophisticated tool where we don't have to say we're just pretending that physics is the final answer to everything in order to do our science, even though we know it isn't. Actually, no, we're doing something valid. As a physicist, you legitimately focus on the physical side of reality. As a biologist, I legitimately ignore what pets do and focus on other kinds of animals, right? And so on. I think I can't really explain this one properly for the lack of time, but statistical inference, I threw up last time this idea that at least with statistics, you can get 95% or so many percent certainty about something, even if you can't get 100%. But this is still subject to the problem of inference, a problem of induction. It doesn't let you get away. The problem of induction is so deep that you don't know, you can't get absolute objective probabilities, I would argue. So the whole idea of statistical inference is that while you can't get from a set of data, a set of numbers, you can't just infer from that the true average, for example. You can calculate an estimate of the average of those numbers, but you don't know what the next number will be. You can't be sure it's true. I mean, if you ask, what number am I going to get on my next roll of a die, and I take the average of the numbers on it, I get 3.5, and obviously that's wrong. So you can't, it's not so simple, but if you have a parameter, then you can test how likely you would be. If you know what the mean is, then you can say what's the probability of getting a particular number when you roll the die, maybe, or some other situation, tossing a coin. So there's a problem with trying to get from data to parameters. It's much easier to go the other way round. And that's what frequentist statistics is all about. And it's very hard to teach students, isn't it, that the p-value you get, I'm afraid I'm not going to explain this, but who uses p-values? Or I do as well. But the p-value you get is not anything very meaningful. It's not the probability that your null hypothesis is true. It is, I think it's supposed to be the probability that you could get data like yours if the null hypothesis were true. It's the other way round. And people then do a very subtle flip of the logic and say, okay, if it's very unlikely to get data like that from no effect going on, then I got data like that, so it's unlikely that there's no effect going on. But that's not valid. It's not that simple. So there's a whole industry based on null hypothesis testing. I'm not saying it's all wrong or that it's not useful, but there is a lazy version of this where it appears that just by feeding numbers into a good computer program, you will get beliefs popping out at the other end, or things that you ought to believe. And the idea of inference to the best explanation, which is very popular, it has been popular in philosophy of science, that you can always find what is the best explanation for your data. Okay, the one that will be most likely to reproduce your data, and you should believe it. But if I hear bumping noises going on in my attic, it might be the most likely explanation for that. The best explanation for that is that there are gremlins playing bowls in my attic. But I don't turn around and believe that hypothesis, right? Because you always factor in some prior probability. And so this fascinating book by Andrew Hartley called Christian and Humanist Foundations for Statistical Inference, which you might never have thought would ever be written, argues that there is something very odd about the frequentist paradigm for statistics because it's trying to get beliefs out of numbers. And Doivid will remind us that beliefs are not related to numbers. They're all aspects that we can abstract from God's world, but the beliefs we have in our minds are something much more complex and they operate on a different level. So he suggests that the Bayesian approach, where you actually have to put beliefs in at the beginning, and what's called the prior distribution of probability, your prior belief, and then you can modify it using the data, using mathematical formulae, and it gives you a modified belief, as it were. That is, he suggests, less reductionistic. Interesting. You might buy that or you might not, but it's worth looking into it. So finally, just to finish, I was suggesting one of our objectives is to think about how we might affirm what's going on in our discipline, then critique it and enrich it. And I like to think of this as a creation, fall, redemption approach. There's good stuff going on. God's common general grace means that all sorts of people do good science and discover things that are very useful, maybe even true. But there are always problems. And maybe sometimes we can spot the problems. And of course, anyone can spot a problem in someone else's theory, using in your own. But then how can we redeem, or at least how can we feed into that? This framework of affirm, critique and enrich comes from Andrew Basden, who's a professor at Salford University who's worked a lot with Doivid's theory. So we did a working group, we put together a working group where we said, let's see if we can do anything with the rather controversial area of conservation science that's called ecosystem services, because this was something I was coming up against in conferences. So in fact, Andrew and also Arthur here, and a number of a few and David and a few other philosophers, and particularly ecologists who are more like postdocs on the whole, put together what we called the Faith and Scholarship Working Group on Ecosystem Services. And we had this idea that the ecosystem services agenda for motivating conservation by saying you'll be sorry if you lose it, and here are the various ways in which the economy will suffer or your food supply will be reduced or whatever. Although it has both strengths and weaknesses. It's much better in some ways than the traditional approach of just saying we ought to protect this forest because it has a right or because God commands us. That might be true, but it doesn't always work. So we said there's strengths in this, but there are also weaknesses. And we did a table where we said, actually, there's no definition of ecosystem services that's logically coherent. Or at least there isn't one that fits what people try and do with it. So we said just logically, we didn't say we're Christians, listen to us. We just said logically we can see a problem with this. We suspect we can understand the sort of ideology that makes it popular, but we don't think we have to stick with it. And then we tried to come up with an alternative framework for thinking about the ways that people appreciate natural places without just calling them ecosystem services. And we actually borrowed quite directly Doivid and Vollenhoven's idea of different aspects of reality to think about the diverse ways that people appreciate natural places. And we're currently waiting to see if the journal's going to accept it. We tried to go below the radar, you see. We didn't say, oh, this is the Christian view, or we're doing theology, or listen to us because we come from the church. We just said, here's a problem we've spotted, here's a solution we can offer. Let's see if it actually is appreciated. And I think that's the end.